In 1975, the country of Argentina hit a per capita income of exactly $6,055. And, why should that incredibly specific number matter to you?
Right.
Well, because according to just mountains of historical data, once a democracy's wealth crosses that exact line, it almost never collapses back into a dictatorship.
It is a fascinating threshold. And understanding why that number exists, it fundamentally changes how you look at the world map.
Yeah.
We're constantly fed this narrative that, building a free society is just about holding an election. But the data tells a much more mechanical story, really.
Absolutely. So welcome to today's deep dive. If you are a curious observer trying to make sense of the constant, often confusing global political shifts you see in the headlines, well, you are in the right place.
For sure.
Our mission today is to unpack a massive stack of sources. We're looking at classical sociological theories, intricate game theoretic models, and global cultural surveys that span decades.
Yeah, it's a lot of material.
It is. And we're going through all of this to answer one critical question, which is, what are the actual underlying social and economic preconditions that allow a democracy to take root and, more importantly, to survive?
And we aren't just going to leave this in the realm of, abstract academic theory.
Right. Nobody wants that.
Exactly. We are going to take these frameworks and apply them directly to countries that are currently navigating transitional phases. Specifically, we're going to put a massive lens on Iran.
Okay.
We'll examine how these hidden socioeconomic forces are, colliding in real time within its borders.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with, I guess, the most comforting popular idea out there, which is the notion that wealth just automatically creates a free society.
Right, the classic theory.
Yeah, back in 1959, there was this wildly influential thesis called Modernization theory, and it argued exactly this. The basic idea was that as a country develops economically, meaning, it gets wealthier, it industrializes, people move to cities, education levels rise, it naturally creates a large middle class. And that middle class inherently pushes for democracy. It was framed as a conveyor belt. You put in factories and wealth on one end, and a vibrant democracy just pops out the other.
It was a highly optimistic view of the post-war world, if we're being honest.
Yeah, very optimistic.
The assumption was that economic development reduces extreme poverty, it diversifies the economy, and just, naturally fosters a culture of political participation.
But I have to push back on this based on the research. If getting richer puts a nation on an inevitable conveyor belt to democracy, how do these frameworks explain authoritarian capitalism?
That is the big question.
Right. Look at the massive, unprecedented economic growth of China over the last 40 years. Right. Or historically, look at the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization, or even a highly wealthy city-state like Singapore. Those examples completely break the conveyor belt.
They do. And that is the exact critique later scholars brought to the table. Our sources highlight a really critical flaw in that 1959 theory. Well, wealth doesn't necessarily cause a democracy to emerge out of nowhere. We have to separate the forces that create a democracy from the forces that help it survive.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. When researchers looked at massive amounts of historical data, and here I'm talking about Adam Przeworski's work, they found that democracies might emerge at almost any level of wealth.
Really? Any level?
Pretty much. Sometimes incredibly poor countries democratize after a sudden crisis. Sometimes wealthy countries do. The transition itself is surprisingly random relative to national wealth.
So wealth doesn't plant the seed?
No, it doesn't. But wealth acts as an incredibly powerful insurance policy once a democracy is already established.
Which brings us back to that $6,055 number from Argentina.
Exactly. The data showed that once a democratic country passes a certain per capita income threshold, historically sitting somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000, democracy becomes an equilibrium.
An equilibrium, meaning it's stable?
Right. Above that line, the wealthy have too much capital and infrastructure to lose from a destructive civil war or a military coup. And simultaneously, the state has enough resources to provide a social safety net.
So the poorest citizens aren't desperate enough to burn the whole system down.
Precisely. The cost of reverting to autocracy just becomes way too high for everyone involved.
That is such a vital distinction for you to keep in mind. When you are watching the news and you see a developing nation hold its very first democratic election, the real test of that system isn't the election itself.
No, it's not.
The real test is whether their economy is robust enough whether they have crossed that survival threshold to prevent a slide back into dictatorship when the first inevitable economic crisis hit.
Right, but aggregate wealth, just the, total amount of money a country has in the bank, is really only part of the story.
Right.
Our sources push us to look deeper into the actual distribution of that wealth. I mean, a massive GDP means nothing for political stability if one guy owns 99% of it.
Yeah, which shifts our conversation perfectly to inequality in the middle class.
Yeah.
There's a famous axiom in sociology by Barrington Moore. It goes, no bourgeoisie, no democracy.
Classic.
Basically, if you don't have a middle class, you don't get a democracy. The sources visualize this using an inverted U-shaped theory from Acemoglu and Robinson.
Yes.
So imagine a U-shape turned upside down. On the far left side, you have societies with very low inequality.
And, low inequality usually just means everyone is equally poor.
Right.
In that scenario, there is no real demand for democracy. Why? Because there isn't any massive hoarded wealth held by an elite that the masses want to redistribute. The society is struggling, but it's relatively stable in its poverty.
Okay, so what happens on the far right side of that inverted U where you have massive, extreme inequality?
That is where a tiny elite owns almost everything. And if the elite were to grant democracy in that environment, the impoverished majority would immediately use their new voting power to heavily tax and redistribute that massive wealth.
Because they finally have a say.
Exactly. And the elite know this. Because the financial cost of democracy is so incredibly high to them, they will gladly spend fortunes on the military and police to violently repress the population rather than share power. Autocracy survives through sheer force.
Wow. So both extremes, total equality, and massive inequality lead to autocracy, which leaves us with the middle of the inverted U, moderate inequality.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is that moderate inequality is the sweet spot for political change. The masses are frustrated enough to organize and pose a credible revolutionary threat to the elites.
But not so frustrated that they want to take everything.
Right. Because the inequality isn't astronomical, the elites do the math. They realize that conceding democracy, giving up some power, and paying slightly higher taxes is actually cheaper and safer than fighting a bloody, endless civil war. So they bargain. They concede.
It is a really cold, rational calculation. But the sources offer a massive counter-perspective from Ansel and Samuels on why this bargaining actually happens.
Yes, they do.
That inverted U model assumes democratization is driven by the poor wanting to tax the rich. But these other scholars argue it is actually driven by a rising, politically disenfranchised middle class trying to protect themselves.
This is a critical pivot in how we understand political motivation. The rising middle class isn't demanding democracy so they can suck the rich. They are the newly rich.
Right, they have the money now.
Exactly. What they fear is the autocratic state itself. Think about how an autocracy functions. The ruler has absolute power. They can arbitrarily seize your property, revoke your business licenses to give a monopoly to their cousin.
Or just freeze your bank accounts if you speak out.
Exactly.
I love this concept. So the rising middle class demanding democracy is basically like a successful startup founder demanding a legally binding contract before doing business with a mob boss.
That's a great way to put it.
They don't necessarily want the mob boss's money, right? They just want an ironclad institutional guarantee that their own hard-earned assets won't be suddenly expropriated.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The middle class demands democracy to create legally binding constraints on the ruler. And this leads directly into another crucial concept from the texts, which is asset specificity.
Okay, break that down for us.
Well, the physical nature of the wealth matters just as much as who holds it.
Explain how the physical nature of wealth changes a country's political system.
Sure. So if a country's wealth is highly specific, meaning it is tied to something immovable, like large agricultural estates, mines, or land, the elite will fight to the death to prevent democracy.
Because land cannot be moved.
Exactly. It is incredibly easy for a new populist democratic government to just confiscate a massive farm and redistribute it.
But if the wealth is in mobile capital like manufacturing equipment, tech companies, or specialized human knowledge, the dynamics completely change.
Completely. If an autocrat tries to seize a tech company or a financial firm, the owners can literally wire their funds to Switzerland, pack their laptops, and hop on a plane.
They just leave.
Right. The elite have an exit option. Because their wealth is highly mobile, conceding to a democracy is vastly less threatening to them. If the new democracy tries to overtax them, they can just leave. The threat of leaving gives them leverage.
So if mobile capital gives the people leverage, and we want to fast-track a country to that $6,000 survival threshold, well, striking oil should be the ultimate democratic catalyst, right?
You'd think.
Yeah, I mean, massive instant wealth for the nation, a booming economy, and a fast track to freedom.
You would think so, but the research points to the exact opposite. Striking oil might be one of the worst things that can happen to an emerging democracy.
Wait, really?
Yeah, this introduces the concept of the resource curse and the rentier state.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. How does massive natural wealth curse a society?
Well, think about the classic democratic bargain. The foundation is, no taxation without representation.
Right, the Boston Tea Party stuff.
Exactly. A normal government needs a productive population. They need you to work, innovate, and start businesses so the government can tax your income to fund the state. You pay taxes, and in return, you demand a voice in how that money is spent.
You have leverage because they actually need your money.
Right. But a rentier state, a country that derives its revenue overwhelmingly from exporting natural resources like oil, doesn't need your money.
Because they're just selling oil.
Right. They get their revenue directly from selling oil to the international market. And Bruce Bueno de Mesquita talks about this with his selectorate theory. The state operates like a trust fund kid.
A trust fund kid. I like that.
Yeah, because the government has this massive independent trust fund, they don't need to tax the citizens. In fact, they often use the oil revenues to hand out subsidies, guarantee government jobs, and fund public services for free.
It sounds like a great deal for the citizens on paper, but the mechanism underneath is kind of insidious, isn't it?
It really is.
Because the state doesn't need to tax you, you completely lose your leverage to demand representation or accountability. The ruler basically just pays you to stay quiet.
The bargain is completely inverted. And the scholars point out a much darker side to this, too.
Which is?
Because the ruler doesn't rely on the population for tax revenue, they have absolutely no incentive to invest in creating a highly educated, innovative populace.
Oh, wow.
In fact, a highly educated populace with free time and communication tools is deeply dangerous to an autocrat. I mean, they might organize an opposition movement.
Right.
So oil wealth allows the ruler to buy loyalty, fund a massive security apparatus, and suppress dissent without ever having to risk political liberalization.
Okay, we have thoroughly explored the hard economics. We've got wealth thresholds, elite bargaining over inequality, mobile versus immobile assets, and the trust fund dynamics of the resource curve.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. But a democratic blueprint needs more than just structural engineering. We have to look at the minds of the citizens themselves.
Yes, the cultural side.
Right, because even if a country manages to hit the perfect economic structure, why do the people actually want the heavy, messy responsibilities of a democratic system? I mean, an autocracy that feeds you is, frankly, a lot easier than a democracy where you have to govern yourself.
That brings us to the subjective side of our sources, specifically the Inglehart-Welzel cultural map.
Okay, what is that?
This is derived from the World Values Survey, which is a massive, decades-long project tracking how human psychology and values shift as societies modernize.
Fascinating.
They found two massive, predictable cultural shifts that track with economic development. The first happens when a society moves from an agrarian farming economy to an industrial one.
What changes in the culture there?
The culture shifts from what they call traditional values, which heavily emphasize religion, deference to absolute authority, rigid family structures, to secular rational values.
So a move towards science and logic.
Exactly. Industrialization requires standardization, so society begins to prioritize science, bureaucracy, and legal rational authority over traditional tribal structures.
But industrialization alone doesn't create democracy. I mean, a society can be highly industrialized and still be a fascist or communist totalitarian regime.
That is the crucial caveat. The democratic magic happens during the second major shift.
Okay, tell us about the second shift.
When a society moves from an industrial economy to a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy, there is a profound psychological transformation. The culture shifts from survival values to self-expression values.
It sounds like Maslow's hierarchy of needs applied to an entire nation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is exactly what it is. Think about the cognitive load of deep poverty. When your entire daily focus is on physical and economic survival, the world feels incredibly dangerous.
You're just trying to get by.
Right. In that state of existential insecurity, people are remarkably tolerant of authoritarianism as long as the strongman promises order, food, and security. They cling to rigid rules and in-group tribalism for protection.
But once that society gets rich enough, Once survival is basically taken for granted.
The fear recedes. Once you know you will have food, shelter, and basic security tomorrow, you no longer need a strong man to protect you from the chaos.
So what replaces that need?
Instead, what the researchers call emancipative values emerge. People begin demanding autonomy over their own lives. They demand gender equality, environmental protections, and most importantly, political voice.
They want a seat at the table.
Exactly. They develop a critical liberal desire for democracy. The psychology shifts from being a passive subject seeking protection to an active citizen demanding participation.
That bridges the gap perfectly between getting richer and actually demanding freedom. So let's take everything we've built here. We have the $6,000 survival threshold,
Right.
the middle-class mob boss analogy, the oil trust fund, and the psychological shift towards self-expression.
Right.
I want to take all these sociological gears and put them inside one very specific engine, Iran.
Iran is perhaps the ultimate real-world pressure cooker for these exact theories. I mean, it is a textbook example of these forces colliding in real time. Historically, if we look at the research of scholars like Mahdavi in our sources, Iran fits the classic model of a rentier state. For decades, massive oil wealth has complicated the democratic jargon.
Because they don't need to tax the people.
Right. The state has historically been able to fund itself and its massive security apparatus without relying on taxing a productive middle class. That severely dampens the leverage of the citizenry.
But here's the friction. Iran isn't just an oil state. It also has a massive, highly educated, hyper-connected, and urbanized population.
Yes, it does.
According to the modernization theory and the cultural map we just discussed, that population should be pushing incredibly hard for those self-expression values.
This raises an important question, though. What happens when a post-industrial, self-expression-oriented population is governed by a state apparatus that operates on traditional rentier state logic?
You get immense structural friction.
Exactly. The Iranian middle class is highly educated. They want the insurance policy against arbitrary state action, but the elites control the immovable assets, the oil, and the state-run monopolies.
Right. The elites don't have mobile capital. They can't just pack up their wealth and move to Switzerland if a democracy takes over, because their wealth is literally tied to the ground and the state structure itself.
So they fight to the death to keep it.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the most mobile asset in Iran is the human capital. The brilliant young engineers, doctors, and students.
And we see the result of that.
Right, because their wealth is in their minds, which is highly mobile. We see a massive brain drain. The people who would normally form the core of that democracy-demanding middle class often exercise their exit option and leave the country altogether.
It's a really challenging dynamic.
So if we look strictly at the source material, what are the actual preconditions required for a country like Iran to successfully navigate a transition to democracy without it just collapsing?
The sources outline a very specific, precarious path. First, economic reform is non-negotiable. If a political transition occurs, the economy must be stabilized and grown to hit that Przorsky survival threshold.
That $6,000 mark.
Right. Given the history of heavy international sanctions, this is incredibly difficult. If the new system cannot provide economic security, the citizens will slip back into survival values, and the new democracy will be vulnerable to a populist autocrat stepping right back in.
You have to have the economic winter coat ready, basically. What else?
Second, bridging the massive inequality gap. We discussed the inverted U-shape. If a transition simply replaces one hoarding elite with another, the public will lose faith immediately.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The new system has to distribute the wealth, especially the resource wealth, in a way that binds the citizens to the state through mutual obligation, not just trust fund handouts.
And third,
Building profound social trust. Darren Isamoglu and James Robinson describe this as the narrow corridor.
a narrow cord, what is that?
It is a fragile space where the state is strong enough to provide services and enforce laws, but society is highly mobilized and organized enough to keep the state in check.
A delicate balance.
Yes. Very delicate. For Iran, transitioning into that narrow corridor requires harnessing the immense civic awareness that already exists in its youth and institutionalizing it so it survives beyond, just initial protests.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If there's one thing to take away from this massive stack of research, It is that democracy is never an inevitable magical byproduct of simply getting richer.
Definitely not.
It is a hard-won equilibrium. It requires a perfect storm. You need the economic independence to not rely on the state for your survival, the cultural emancipation to demand a voice, and the strategic bargaining power to force elites to concede power legally rather than violently.
It is a delicate, intricate architecture, and it requires constant maintenance.
So next time you open a news app and see protests in Tehran or an election in an emerging nation, don't just look at the political slogans on the signs. Look deeper.
Yeah, look at the underlying structures.
Exactly. Look at what the protesters do for a living.
Huh.
Are their assets mobile, or are they tied to the land? Look at how the government funds itself. Do they need the citizens' taxes, or are they sitting on an oil trust fund? That underlying math tells you whether a regime will bargain or whether they will fight.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, building on everything we've just uncovered.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have seen how physical assets like agricultural land and oil create one specific type of political system, while mobile capital like manufacturing creates another.
Right.
But as we move rapidly into an era where the most valuable assets in the world are entirely digital, decentralized, and borderless, think about artificial intelligence algorithms and cryptocurrency, how will this change the blueprint?
Oh, wow. That's a great question.
Right. Will this hypermobile, invisible wealth force the ultimate global democratization because it simply cannot be seized by the state? Or will elites find entirely new, invisible ways to hoard these digital assets, acting as modern digital rentier states?
It makes you wonder if the architects of tomorrow's democracies are going to need an entirely different kind of blueprint altogether. Definitely something to think about. Until next time.